Today we will talk about how to connect to practically any tools API in N8N. APIs can usually be used to get data out of tools, put data, synchronize data into tools, and automate different types of tasks within tools. And while there are many tools that have already built an N8N node, which we can use to visually integrate with them, these are usually more limited than their API. And also there are many more niche tools which don't have a visual node. So for these, knowing how to build an API connection in N8N is going to be very useful. Fortunately, N8N makes it relatively easy to talk to any API using the HTTP request node, but there are still a bunch of more technical details and roadblocks that we need to get through. So I'm going to start with the absolute basics in this video and build towards more advanced applications of APIs. And so first we will need a daily weather forecast email automation. Then we will build a simple recipe finder application which interacts with a recipe database using an API. And finally, I will show how to build an AI agent that can talk to some of these APIs for us using the HTTP request tool that we can give to AI agents in N8N. So let's look at our first small project today, which is that we want to send an automated email with the weather forecast for today in the title and then also tomorrow in the body. So for this, we need some external tool to do this. Our N8N doesn't know it by itself. So we need to interact with an API that our N8N can call, or any other automation tool code can call and get this information. And one of the free to use solutions is MeteoSource, which is nice enough to provide a forever free package with 400 daily calls. So that's more than enough for us to experiment on and even build a simple application on. All they ask is that the application should display the message powered by MeteoSource and the link to them. And so this is true for any API integration, any custom API integration. We need to look for two things. One of them is the API key and the other one is the documentation. So we can think about an API key as our password to access the API, and usually for paid APIs, that's going to include our limit. So for each API key, we can do only a certain number of things, or we have to pay for extra things. So we have to really make sure not to show it. In most cases, treating it like a password. And we have a documentation, which is practically a manual that shows us what calls we can make, what functionalities the API have, and how can we use those functionalities specifically. So to get both of these things, in our case from MeteoSource, we need to go to their website and first go to the sign up page, create an account, then we can log in. And it's going to be very simple. In this case, we just get our API key as soon as we have logged in, and we can reset it at any time, in which case the old one would be eliminated and we would get a new API key. This is useful if we think that someone saw our API key, for example, just like we would change a password, or periodically we probably should do it anyway. And then the other thing that we need from this website is the documentation page, which we can use to see what are the possibilities with this API. So once we have found both of these things for ourselves, we can go back to N8N and start building. So really the core of any custom API integration in N8N is the HTTP request node that we will now add. What the HTTP request node allows us is to call URLs, call links, just like the browser would do them, and basically get the answer that the browser would also get. But there are some additional request types that we can use to interact with APIs. For now, we can leave it at GET because that's what this API only uses. And in general, if they don't specify what request type we have to use in the documentation, then we can be quite sure that the request we have to do is a GET request. So just to try out that our HTTP request node actually works, it does what it's supposed to do, we can write in the example.com domain name in the URL and execute it to see what happens. So for example, we can try just to make sure that this node works and it can actually get our URL responses. We can put in google.com and see what happens. Basically, we can see that it got us back this long code that normally our browser would render into what google.com is. But here we cannot do much with it because this specific website isn't really designed for us to interact automatically with it. So instead, we should be using APIs, which are specifically meant for these cases, and it's going to return data for us in a format that we can use much simpler. So as our next step, let's go back to the API documentation, where we can find what are the endpoints and what are the things that we can do with this API. It is quite common that we would get these different endpoints, and each of them would include a URL that we can call. And so for now, we have to find out which one we're actually interested in. And the weather and forecast looks quite satisfactory for our needs. And everything is quite is explained in quite a lot of detail. If we want to look at it, each of the parameters are included or explained. But for the most part, we can just get started with the example API request, which is basically an example URL that we can use to call this API. The only thing is that it's not including our API key, so we have to make sure to replace it with that. So let's go back here and add this URL for us here. And what we can already do is just change this key to our API key. But as I said before, this is sort of a password, so we don't just simply want to include it in our workflow definition, because then anyone can see it. And also we would have to put it into each time we are calling this API. So what we should do instead is that we remove this part with the key equal API key, and we create our authentication. And to authenticate to the API properly, we have to go to authentication and create a generic credential type. So predefined credential types are good for services that N8N has a built-in node for. So whenever we are doing a custom API integration, then we have to go to generic. And here what we can see is that there are many different kind of authentication possibilities. So also the slides, which are available as part of the video notes down in the description, also has the direct link to the N8N credential documentation. And here we can see all of them in detail, how to use them and what are the cases that we want to use them. But really the simplest one is going to be the query auth for us. And in any situation, when we see that in the URL, we have this something equals our API key, then we have to use query auth. In the later part of the video, with another API, I will show other authentication methods, but this is probably the most common, at least for the APIs that don't have to be very secure. And so once we chose the query auth, we can add our query auth credential, and for this we have to first name it. I will name it MeteoSource credentials. So always try to name this based on the service that we use, so it's going to be easy to identify. And then for the name, we have to choose what is before the equal sign, so what this parameter's name is. And then for the value, I will paste the API key and I will save it. And now we can actually test it, and we can see that even though we do not include the API key in our URL, we only have it as part of our credential. It's going to actually provide us with the output. So we just use the example location here, which is London, and on the right side of the node, we can go to table to get the most easy to navigate view of our output data. And here we can see what we're actually interested in is going to be the daily version of the forecast. And we can see that this is our summary, which we got for day 0, which is today. So this is actually what we are looking for. And then tomorrow's we can find it a little bit later down, and we can also get some extra data like current and hourly, which we don't need for this use case, but they are also returned by this HTTP request. Then as a final step of this automation, we should set up our Gmail node to actually send this email. So if you don't have Gmail set up yet, then the slide has the link to the documentation as well, but here I'm going to assume that we have that working already. So we can use the Gmail node and use the send message action, where I will just add my subject and the message. And once we did that, we can use the output from the HTTP request to actually add the values. And once we did that, we can click on execute step, or to make sure that the entire automation from the beginning to end is working, we can also go out and click on execute workflow. And then if I go to my email account, then I have actually received this email just now, 0 minutes ago. The small thing is that automatically N8N adds this attribution. So if we don't want that, then we can remove it. And also in our case, if we want, we can actually add this powered by MeteoSource to comply with the license, especially if we would be sending it for outside parties. So yes, this already does what we want from it. And then if we actually want to receive this every morning, then we have to use the schedule trigger, and we can say that every midnight or say every 7 a.m. it should run, and as a final step set it from inactive to active, and now this is going to actually run every morning and we will be receiving these messages. So just as a quick best practices addition, let's do these two things. We can basically move from the URL to a more structured way our configuration, and we can also make a separate edit node where we keep our data. So to do this, let's go to the HTTP request node, and what we see is that all of the different things that we are here giving to our API are just part of the URL. And so instead, we can use these send query parameters of N8N. And for example, we can remove the place ID and move the key value pair down into this query parameters part, which is going to show us a little bit more structure, and it will be a little bit more easy to see what we can change. And then another improvement could be to actually add an edit field node between our HTTP request and the schedule. And once we did that, we can say that we define our place ID in this separate edit fields, and when we run the edit fields, then we can go to the HTTP request and add a computed value to this place ID instead. So this way we can get our place ID from outside of the HTTP request node itself, and we can, if we want to change it easier, or replace it with Google Sheets or whatever other node that we're pulling data from, and that way we can actually keep this dynamic. Now let's look at our second project for the day, which will be a recipe finder application. So it's a slightly more advanced use case of an API. Here we would in the beginning have a form that we would write our query in natural language, and we use an API on the backend that actually finds us a recipe for that query. So this is not what comes back from a prompt. This is an actual recipe that we can find through an API. And this API will also use a different authentication method, so I can show that too. So next, to see what API we are going to be using, I have found this recipe API by API Ninjas. The link is in the slides, and also it's on the screen where you can just go to the main screen. And this is nice because they have 10,000 requests each month, if I remember correctly, on their free package, which is only for development, but that's going to be good for us. And basically all you need to do And on the right side, we can see an example API call, and we also see the API key header for it. So what we can see as a difference from earlier is that in here the API key is not part of the URL itself. It is sent separately as part of a header. And if we look at our authentication options from earlier, then we can see that we also have this header auth option, which is exactly for these cases. And I would say that that's the other common one for more simple APIs apart from query auth. And the actually basic and bearer is also quite similar. So this is a very similar process will work for almost all API types. So what we need to do is similarly as before, we're copying our API key, and then we would add our credential in an HTTP request node, which will be a generic credential type, but here instead of query auth, we will be using header auth. And we can add our new header auth credential by clicking on create new credential and then name it based on the service that we will use as before. And from here, we can find the key and the API key, so we can just copy each of them into the credential. And once we copied both our API key and the name, which we found there, we can click on save, and from now on, we will be able to send authenticated API requests to this server. But now to make things a little bit simpler, I will already use the form submit trigger, which is this on form submission trigger. And here basically we can create a simple form by just adding the name, and then we already have that working. Next, we need to go back to the documentation page where we can see what is the specific URL of the API that we want to call. And again, we know that this is a GET request. So basically, as I did before, I'm going to remove this key value type pair with the query, and instead I will send them as a query parameter. And I can test this now with pizza napoletana. And what we will see when I hit that test. Okay, for some reason this did not go through. Oh yeah, okay, didn't have our value yet, so we should be able to drag the form value into here, and then it's going to work. We can see that in the output it actually got all the data that we wanted. And from here we only have to change that we are not responding right away to the form, which there is this option. And then we have to use the form ending action to send a response. So I think, I don't know how I can format it best, but in the completion message, we can use HTML if we want to. So for example, I can use this H3, which is a lower level header, so it's going to look a little better. And just say ingredients, and same for instructions. I can add from the table, which did not go to the correct location, but now it is. So we can see what happens with our execute step, which again, okay, that did not work, but we can execute the whole workflow. And now we should be able to get this final result. And if we want to publish it, we can go to inactive. And right now this form does not have any authentication. So if we get to the production URL, then we can actually send it to anyone and expose our application to them. So that was this little project. And what one of the takeaways is that when we see these headers as the authentication method in the documentation, then we have to use the header auth. And the way how we can set it up is that into the key section we put the name of the header, and in the value section we put the value of the header, and then we don't have to do anything else. And then, similarly to what we did before, we will just use our URL, and we can use query parameters if we want to do that, where we can again as name and value pairs we can add things. Yes, so none of these were post requests, but I will just as an extra also say that if we were using post requests, then we most likely have to also specify a body, which 99% of the time body content type JSON will work, and then we practically have to work with the body similarly that we were doing with the query, that we're basically specifying name and value pairs, and we can use this using the fields below, or we can write it out as an entire JSON in some cases. But yes, for GET request, we rarely have to send body, and all we need to generally do is set our parameters using the query parameters flag, and then we can use dynamic values and the names. And as the last part of this tutorial, let's turn this into a simple AI agent to demonstrate how AI agents can call APIs. So I will build this next to our already existing automation. We will here be using a chat message trigger, which is for the N8N built-in chatbot. And we will be using the AI agent node, which is usually what we use to build agents. We don't really need a memory here. We will of course need a chat model that we can choose anything that we would normally use. So here I'm going to use the OpenAI chat model. We need to have an OpenAI account connected to this, and since ChatGPT 5 is out now, I will use the mini version of this. Usually the mini version will be more than enough for such a simple use case. And again, we don't need memory because this will be just a one-off question answer agent. But we need an HTTP request tool to basically use the same functionality that we before did manually. So for the authentication, we already have our auth setup, we just have to choose it, and we have to add the URL the same, and we will be sending query parameters just like we did before, and the name here will be query. And for this, the only real difference is that we can click on this star icon, and then the value will be defined by the model. So this is the way how we can give the tool to an agent that it can choose what the value of the query will be. And then we have to give some description so the model understands what this tool does. So I just simply gave a description, and we don't need to do anything else here. All we need to do is get ready and test it. So for example, I can ask from it, give me a recipe of pizza, and then we can see that it is going to be using the OpenAI chat model to first generate the completion, and we can also see that it used our HTTP request tool to actually query the API with the parameter pizza, and then it got back the ingredients and instructions which were fed back to the model, and basically it gave us these instructions, possibly summarized or reformatted. But yes, basically this allowed it to complete the instruction and give us an actual recipe that came from this API instead of coming up with something. So yes, this is the AI agent version of the same recipe finder. Of course, in reality, we might want to add more tools to the same agent so it is usable in multiple contexts or multiple tasks, and we can specify a memory for it. The simplest one is, as the name says, simple memory, which will allow it to keep up a conversation. Also, we can even turn this into an MCP server, in which case the MCP server would have this tool, and then we can connect our ChatGPT or Claude directly into it. So yes, this is the AI agent version of the recipe finder. I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to not miss out on similar videos, and grab the video notes down in the description with all the templates included. See you in the next one.